how wonderful to be able to talk to you in this way. I'm currently in London. Very much looking forward to the discussion. So what I'm going to try and do is just set up some background on what we're doing and what we're thinking. And if anyone wants to get in touch with me afterwards, my email is John, John, at Volans, VOLANS.com. I'll put that on the final slide as well. So if it's all right, what I'll do is just pull up some slides and speak. Can I just check, so Alfonso, can you see that? You
okay.
can't see, it's not
the,
sharing yet.
The option to share your screen. If you want, you can share your screen.
Yeah, no, I will do. I'll try again. It's just a little while since I've done this. We've got into the habit now with lockdowns ending, just doing things face to face, and I'm also increasingly not using slides at all. But can you see that?
Yeah, we can see it. Thank you, John.
Okay, good. Okay, so what I'm going to take you through is some thoughts on where we are in all of this and where we might be headed. And I'm going to talk about green swans. I'll explain in a moment what those are. But just before I get started, the world sort of often to me seems to split into several different camps. And there are people who are extremely pessimistic about our chances to turn the corner on climate change, biodiversity loss, and these great issues of our time. And there are others who feel that, for example, technology and new business models will save us. I oscillate between the two, but I was born an optimist. I've always felt that the world would progress once it woke up properly to the scale of what we're now facing. I've chosen to work throughout most of my life with business. And again, that brings in the optimism to some degree, because business people tend to believe in progress. Now, my first question is, who in all of this actually cares about where we're headed? And some of you may have just seen recently somebody who was then the global head of responsible investing at HSBC, a very big global bank, saying, you know, basically, who cares if Miami is 6 meters underwater by the end of the century or in 100 years from now? He lost his job because he said that, but in fact I think he was doing us a service, because I think much of our financial system does not think about these sorts of issues nearly seriously enough as yet. And to that question of who cares, I do a lot of work in countries like Brazil, for example, and I put this slide together when I was in Sao Paulo recently. And it's based on a survey that was done for Nature magazine, the science journal, which looked at 10,000 young people around the world. And it's very striking that the highest levels of eco or climate anxiety around the world now are found in countries like the Philippines, India, and Brazil. I mean, if you'd asked me where I'd point my finger on the map, it certainly wouldn't have been those countries. And then among the higher income countries, Portugal came up highest, and not least because when the survey was carried out, there were a huge number of fires burning across that country. So I'm going to just say a couple of quick things about where we fit into a wider landscape. I've used this cartoon for about 45 years now. I can't remember who did it. I've tried to find the cartoonist, but I've failed. But it basically was a summary of the world when certainly I came into this space. So I've been 50 years now this year professionally involved on environment, sustainability, regenerative economy, social entrepreneurship, biotechnology, all of these different things. During that time, I've set up 4 companies, all social businesses, as we would now call them, since 1978. They all still exist. The third one, which was called Sustainability, we set up in 1987. That's now owned by KKR, the private equity group. If you told me when we set that organization up in the kitchen of my family home that it would end up being owned by the barbarians at the Gators, they were then known, I would have jumped out a nearby window, I suspect. I'm delighted and privileged to be a visiting professor at 3 universities. I love the interaction with students, and again, I'm looking forward to our exchange today. I've served now on over 80 boards or advisory boards, from very large multinational corporations down to very small social enterprises. And I'll touch on this, but I've just finished my 21st book just yesterday. So this is a sense of who we are. We mainly work with business by choice. We're very selective with the companies we work with. There's almost an A to Z there, Acciona in Spain through to Zug, a venture capital outfit based in London. As I said, we mainly work with business, but there's one public sector institution there, the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency. We've worked with them for several years. I can explain that if you're interested later on. But this is, in a way, how we view the world. And my most recent book that came out in 2020, Green Swans, mapped out what we then saw and continue to see happening in the world. So in a big picture frame, we're moving from a focus throughout much of my working career on responsibility, corporate social responsibility, citizenship, all of that good stuff, accountability, transparency and so on. But what we're finding increasingly is that the world is starting to wobble, and wobble quite severely. And that's happened to economies, it's happening to our societies, it's certainly happening to the climate system and the biosphere. So the way we're thinking about this is that we've got to expand the spotlight in boardrooms in particular, but throughout the business community, from just doing what feels to be the right thing in terms of engaging a wider set of stakeholders, that's the responsibility agenda, to properly beginning to address the resilience challenges. And I'll touch on the Ukraine conflict, I'll touch on the pandemic in just a moment. And the only way that I know to ensure the long-term health of all of the different systems on which we depend is to regenerate them. So all of these 3 different trajectories, I won't go through the detail. All of the detail comes from work that we've done with client companies. They've populated these data points as we went along. And, even the best companies, even the best economies in the world are halfway along, and most of them aren't anywhere near that. So I've talked about, for about 5 or 6 years now, about the risk, in fact, the reality increasingly, that we're moving into a U-bend. Every so often, perhaps every 60 to 80 years, an economic order, macroeconomic, geopolitical, starts to come apart. It starts to fail. It starts to weaken. And I think that's what's happening in so many different ways at the moment. Now, a lot of people will find that a terrifying prediction or assessment. I don't. I actually think it's only when you get into a period where the old order is failing that you can properly start to build the replacement system or systems. But at the bottom, in that sort of pinky red line, you see one of our great problems of the moment, which is populism. I don't have to tell you all that. We've had a very bad attack of it ourselves. That's not going to end anytime soon, is part of my message. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic, for a lot of people, came out of the blue. A lot of us have been sort of predicting global pandemics for quite some time. Governments have been doing work on that and then ignoring that work for too long. I think what was really interesting about the reaction of business in particular, but governments to some degree, was that they saw this as a systemic crisis. And what we're talking about is the need for system change. So in some ways, although we wished it hadn't happened, the pandemic was quite useful. And then we had the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I was in Costa Rica when that happened. And so I was in a country which totally devoted now to regeneration at a time when Vladimir Putin and his allies were trying to take apart an economy and a society. So very much the forces of degeneration. And you had lots of predictions at that time about what would happen, energy security, food security issues, and so on. That's still playing through, but I think this is a an extraordinary moment in our collective history where we start to see things rather differently. And the most recent climate report, this isn't that, it's an earlier one, I think should give us all, if not sleepless nights, I mean, a sense that unless we act in very short order now, things are going to get completely out of hand. Now, when I'm finally buried, or whatever they do with my mortal remains, if there is anything like a tombstone, they'll probably put on it something like, you know, he coined the triple bottom line or whatever. That happened in 1994. A couple of years earlier, prior to that, I did this cartoon, or at least I had a Financial Times cartoonist do it for me. And it still informs pretty much all the work that we do. And it basically shows a boardroom table with three characters around it. I mean, all the conventional boardroom roles flagged up there, but the fish representing nature, the woman representing the dispossessed, the poor, and so on, and the robot at that time simply representing the long-term future. That's no longer the case. It's quite interesting to see that the first expert system was appointed to a board in Hong Kong in 2014. Increasingly, artificial intelligence is going to be used to try and tackle some of the complexities in the system of ours. On the right there, you have the headline from a Harvard Business Review article that I did in 2018, which recalled the triple bottom line. And a lot of people understood that to be, you know, it was a bad idea, let's end it. I've worked with companies like Ford, with Volvo, Toyota, and so on. And for those sorts of people, a product recall is something very different. You have a perfectly functional product, but with some sort of weakness or defect. You pull it back, you service it, you put it back on the road. And that's precisely what we aim to do with the triple bottom line. And if you look around the world now, you see the agenda, change agenda, taking on many, many different faces. The UN Sustainable Development Goals are one example of that. I'm quite struck here that in the second line on the furthest to the left, you have regeneration coming in, but there are so many different issues. And that's one of the things that the boards that we work with are often not surprised by so much as just dazed by, you know, which of these things is the real priority? What should we be focusing on now? We were the first B Corporation in the UK. We incubated B Lab UK for the first 9 months of its year. I'm somewhere in this crowd. It was a B Corporation Summit I spoke at a couple of years back in Amsterdam. We love that movement, and it's one of the things that gives me great inspiration. But at the same time, we have the pushback. We have the anti-woke movement. We have the anti-ESG movement. We have companies like BlackRock and Larry Fink, its CEO, under intense pressure from states like Texas, Louisiana, Florida. Basically, people saying, you know, this is ESG, environment, social, and governance investment and so on, is not capitalism. It's really interesting now to see the pushback where people saying this is very much capitalism, but it's not today's capitalism, it's tomorrow's. At the same time, you have some of these complaints which I sympathize with. I mean, Elon Musk being delisted by Standard & Poor's, and for various reasons, but at the same time, ExxonMobil being pulled into the rankings as an example, a paragon of excellence. I mean, I've had some fairly intense personal battles with Exxon over the years. It's a travesty, but in a way, that's how rankings work. So one of my messages is, whether we like it or not, this agenda of ours is going to become very much more political. So, swans. Some of you will have read. If you haven't, I recommend the book by Nassim Nicholas Taleb, The Black Swan. Came out just before the 2007-2009 crash, was seen to be completely prescient. What he talks about is events which they come from completely outside the system, come out of the blue. They have an off-the-scale impact. And afterwards, we try and work out what's happened to us, and we actually find that We think we know what's happened to us, but we very often get it wrong. So we set ourselves up to fail again. Taleb has been asked that quite a number of times now. So was COVID-19 a black swan? His answer, absolutely not. Because we saw it coming, we saw epidemics coming, we saw coronavirus epidemics coming. We just simply failed to pay attention and to act in good time. So I was on the faculty of the World Economic Forum for 7 years, and one of the things I look at quite carefully is their assessment each year of what some of the big risks are, their global risks report. And in the most recent one, they talked about tomorrow's black swans. And it's interesting, I won't read them out, but if you look along the line, how many of those now are to do with climate, biodiversity, natural resources, and social cohesion, exactly the sorts of things that we're talking about in the sustainability agenda, in the ESG agenda, and so on. And isn't it extraordinary that you now have a supposedly apolitical organization, the United Nations, in public, and their Secretary General talking in these terms, basically saying that the fossil fuels industry is semi-criminal. This again, to me, is an indicator of how this whole agenda is beginning to pick up not only momentum, but political charge. And we can discuss whether you think that's a good thing or not, but I think it's an inevitable thing, and it's something we're all going to have to learn how to manage. So when we think about green swans, we're not thinking about individual companies. We're thinking about market or political trajectories. So, for example, when the European Union came up with its, in effect, Green New Deal, when the Biden administration, which you will all know very well, came up with the Inflation Reduction Act, these are examples of, at least in my mind, green swan shifts in the system, as are some of the spectacularly declining price points of technologies. This is a chart, obviously, based on renewable energy, particularly solar. You could do the same thing for wind. You could do the same thing for battery technology. You could do it for many other technologies as well. But technology will not save us. It's part of it's part of the toolbox that we will need. It's exciting. It's a positive contributor, but it won't deliver the transformation that I believe that we need. So, and transformation is not going to be easy. So among the companies that we work with, and where we do work with businesses, we work very close in over many years. And we once working with a big energy company where, this is about 20 years ago, and one of the board members said, what you bring to the party is constructive discomfort. So we're not in there as sort of total friends agreeing with everything that they are suggesting. We're quite challenging. Neste, based in Finland, used to be this, well, still is the state-owned oil company. They used to make their living by refining Russian oil. But quite some years ago, they started a mad scramble out of oil, increasingly into renewable energy, into things like sustainable aviation fuels. And we're working with them on that. We really like the company, but 18 months, 2 years ago, they ran into a brick wall with Coldplay, a band some of you may have heard of. Coldplay were going to use Neste's sustainable aviation fuels to fuel their global tour. An activist group went after Coldplay. They backed out. This caused quite a degree of distress. Neste was actually quite unnecessary. The activist group wasn't wrong, but it wasn't actually right either. And the net result was not, I don't think, very helpful. But we're going to see a lot more of this sort of tension, this sort of conflict, this sort of these thought processes playing out in the public domain. So towards the conclusion, one of the things I think is going to happen a lot, and I worked with Ford for quite some years. I worked with Bill Ford in the early part of this century for some years. And I remember talking to people in Dearborn, near Detroit, at Ford, about electric vehicles. And I remember, too, pointing out Elon Musk when he started to pop up on the horizon about 2000, 2004. And I said, that's interesting, Tesla and so on. And I was told by a number of people. We tried electric vehicles. We tried them 100 years ago. It didn't work then. It's not going to work now. I wonder how many other industries are going through that sort of thought train. And if you had suggested to Bill, if you suggested to his board or his top management team then that Ford will split into two, they would have denied it absolutely. And that's exactly what's now happening. Now, the new part is not yet profitable, so they're framing it as a startup. But I think more and more major companies are now having to go through this process of thinking, how do you break out the bits of the business that will have a very successful future and free them up from some of the problems of the older parts? Solvay is another business that's going the same route, and it's quite interesting with them that the new part, the second group of bullet points, is the new part of the business, and it's the one that's more sustainability focused. It's already bigger than the legacy business. So a couple of points. One is that, as I've already said, this is going to become political, whether we like it or not. And one of the reasons is that these changes are going to drive a lot of industries to extinction, and much, much faster than we might imagine. So they're going to fight back, and they're going to fight back increasingly viciously. The book that I finished yesterday looks at these industries and their leaders in effect as sharks. And basically the question I've been asking is, how do you best deal with those corporate and industrial sharks? This is a picture that I love to hate. This is Scott Morrison when he was still Prime Minister of Australia, coming into the Parliament with a lump of coal and saying, this is the future. Well, it really wasn't then, and it hasn't been since. He's been booted out of power by voters who basically consider that his party was completely wrong on environment and on social issues as well. I think we'll see a lot more of that. I think the IRA, which to me has a rather different meaning, having grown up in Ireland in the 1950s, but the Inflation Reduction Act, I think, is very exciting. I think it's causing massive heartache and soul searching in the European Union, people wanting to do something very similar. Now we can agree or disagree on subsidies and their role, but the impact in terms of industries in clean energy and so on will be very considerable indeed. A couple of final slides. We've increasingly talked about the regenerative economy. The subtitle of my last book, Green Swans, was all about that regeneration trajectory in our societies. One of the reasons is because it is fundamentally intrinsically upbeat. One of the companies, another company that we work with in Spain is Elkington. I mentioned them earlier on, a very big infrastructure company. So for example, I visited Sao Paulo just a few months back to see the very big construction project that Elkington are doing there, which is a complete new line of the subway system. We've worked with the company for about 2.5 years now as one part of the result of that, of the outcome. And they're a very big company. They've adopted the strapline, regenerative by design, but they're now trying to build it into all of their contract negotiation processes to get their negotiators to listen for early weak signals of people being interested in some aspect of regeneration, and then to build upon that. Let me stop there. I threatened you with my email address. It's at the bottom there. I answer all emails that are sent to me. The website is also there. Let me just stop sharing, say thank you, and go back to you, Saul Alfonso, if I might.
Thank you, John. This was a very interesting talk. I'm going to open the opportunity for anyone who has any kind of question to express their comments, their doubts, their questions. And I would like to be the first into making a question. Would like to know your opinion about what will be the role of universities and colleges in these changes that we are seeing in the organizations?
I think it'll be fundamental. LinkedIn just did a survey, some of you may have read about it, where they looked at the proportion of profiles of LinkedIn members which mentioned skills in the sustainability space. They then looked at the ads for those sorts of skills, people actually recruiting. And they found that there was actually quite a significant gap between the skills base as we currently have it and the skills base that we will need in future, as indicated by those job ads. To your question, I've worked with business schools now for about 40 years, and I think they have betrayed over decades generation after generation of MBA and other B school students, because individual faculty members would wake up to the need. Quite often students themselves would wake up to the need, but the ranking systems for business schools and universities have tended to suppress some of the work that needs to be done. We're now working with a range of business schools in Japan, in Spain, in Denmark, elsewhere, on trying to work out what that new agenda will look like and what sort of skills will be needed. I think the university sector is going to be absolutely fundamental, but I think it's going to have to be reconfigured, because I think it's teaching in silos. It's teaching things in the old linear mindset too often. And I think we actually need to reconfigure universities at exactly the same time that we reconfigure our economies. But maybe the internet and its various versions that are now sort of crashing through, including things like ChatGPT and so on, maybe that's an opportunity for very different forms of education, self-driven learning and so on, to come through. So I'd love to hear your views on universities. I think they have a very exciting future, but I don't think that will be achieved without a great deal of change and transformation along the way.
Okay, thank you so much. I want to ask Dr. Jim Washam to share with us his comment about this topic. And after that, if any of the students has any kind of question, please raise your digital hand. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Sal. I'm excited about it. I'm excited to be here today. And I think this is a really important topic, and it's something that I think is going to be one of the major business issues over the next 30 years. So if you start looking at what the big things are coming up, I think this is going to be it. And so, you mentioned the role of the universities. We've got to that right now. We've been at that point where people start to bring things up, but it's not pressing is probably the wrong word.
Yeah.
But we're not at that point yet where people jump behind it as quickly as they should. But like I said, I think it's going to be probably the big issue over the next several years. We need to prepare for that.
No, I completely agree. But I remember about 12, 13 years ago being at the Wharton School, and the dean came up to me after we'd done a presentation to about 60 professors from around the world on sustainability related issues. And the dean said, this is going to be what we teach at Wharton and other business schools in the future. And I said, well, I agree, of course, but it's taking an unconscionably long time to get to the point where that's happening. So I absolutely agree. But I think in so many areas of our societies and economies and all the rest of it, we're leaving things and we're leaving things and we're doing things incrementally. And what that suggests is when change comes, rather than being manageable, it just goes through an inflection point, and it goes absolutely screamingly exponential. And when that happens, exactly what happened to companies like Ford when Tesla suddenly hove in view and just wiped out their prospects of selling internal combustion engines way into the future, as they'd expected. So I think the university sector is itself ripe to be disrupted. But just a final point, I think, although I'm blaming business schools and universities, I don't think students have been as active in asking for some of the things that they will need. And part of the reason for that is there's been this sedation effect where, people have had to scramble somewhat harder than in the 60s or 70s or whatever for jobs. So they're tending to do what they think employers will want. But just in recent years, and it's not just Greta Thunberg driving this, younger people have really switched on and back to that eco-anxiety and climate anxiety agenda. That evidence of that is everywhere. So I think we've and that could go to anger, and it could go to I went to university with somebody who I thought I knew quite well. She went to prison for 10 years for trying to blow up British government ministers. She was part of something called the Angry Brigade. I also knew people in Germany pretty much around the same time, early 1970s. They turned out to be part of the support group of the Baader-Meinhof gang. You probably won't know of them, but they killed a number of industrialists, a number of politicians. They killed the father of somebody who became my friend in Berlin many years later. And when I look back at those people that I knew, not that well, but I knew, they were all very bright. They were all very intelligent. They all wanted to change the world. And if there was one pattern to what they would say afterwards when they were captured, if they weren't killed, we tried to change the system resisted, we got angry, and so bang. So the Weathermen and people like that would have been similar examples in the United States. So I'm not saying that we're automatically going down that route, but if we don't act fairly quickly, I think there's a very real and growing risk that we might.
Yeah, and that you mentioned one thing that I really find hopeful in this generation is this generation seems to be driven by purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's going to help us push this forward too.
Yeah, I think purpose is enormously important, and it's certainly been a wave that's built quite strongly around the world, or at least in the OECD world. I think people understand very different things about it, and I think any purpose is going to be enough. And I often say, the Angry Brigade had a purpose. So let's at least be sure that what we do adopt as a purpose is fit for the future. But back to, let's see whether the questions or comments.
Okay, thank you. We have a question or comment from Tanya. Tanya, go ahead.
Okay, so I would like to say thank you for being here and thank you for this enlightening talk. And I would like to know, like, from your perspective, well, like, that one day we will be employees or managers, and what can we do from your experience to help into this change or transformation that we are facing in this new era? Because I think that from one side we have to start to unlearn things to relearn them and to make the change. So I would like to know, like, from your experience, what do you think about this?
Well, thanks, Tanya. And I think in a way, I'm going to have to speak to some degree in paradoxes, in the sense that you're going to have to be impatient and have this incredible sense of urgency, because that's the reality that we now find ourselves in. And yet you're going to have to be patient, and you're going to have to accept that many of the people you're working with were brought up, educated in a very different world. And if you go too hard at them and too fast, you panic them. And so I think we've got to have this sense of, we haven't got all the time in the world remotely, but this is a change. This is a paradigm shift in the genuine sense of that word, and it's going to take decades and even generations to crank through. So throughout your careers, throughout your working lives, you will be driving and helping to catalyze these sorts of changes. So specifically, what should you do? I think firstly, try and join an organization, whether it's a company or anything else, that is, in your sense, as the best due diligence you can do, likely to head in the right direction. That's the most critical decision that you will make. And I was just hearing yesterday from somebody who knows ExxonMobil really, really well, saying that they're really struggling at the moment to find bright, educated people because of their criminal activities, trying to sort of head off effective climate action over so long. And I say criminal because I think it will be seen to be criminal in a very short period of time. The second thing would be to brief yourself and just continue reading relatively widely about the sort of frontiers of change. I personally am fascinated by science and technology, have been pretty much forever, but I don't just read stuff. I go and see people. And one of the things you can do when you're young, perhaps easier than, more easily than you can when you're a bit older and locked in by family or employment, is just to get in touch with people who you're interested in. It's remarkable how often when you do that, people are prepared to talk. If you then go and visit them, you then have a story, part of a story, which helps influence and change the minds of the people that you're then working with. I think in any organization that you then join, networking, finding the people who think somewhat along the lines that you do, and building your external networks, it's much easier to do that now than it once would have been. But again, to sort of reach out to the people who are completely unlike you, and there's still a lot of those in any sector of our society or economy. In fact, some of the most generative conversations I've had have been people who really hate what people like me have tried to champion. And if I go far enough back, and I stop after this, but say 30, 35 years ago, people at the head of major companies would describe people like me as watermelons, you know, green on the outside, but red in the inside. So you were, just because you were active, you were seen to be a communist, and that wasn't necessarily seen to be a good thing. So back to the questions, Sandra.
Hi, first, just as my classmate mentioned, thank you so much for having you here. You have really given us a really valuable insight. And I actually have two questions. If I might. The first one is, which one do you consider that would be the role of the consumer in helping companies to achieve and promote all these sustainable practices?
Yeah. Well, if I start with that one, then do your second question. Consumers are absolutely critical, but they're very hard to mobilize. So you get these spikes of activity around a particular issue or concern, and that can have an impact. But in 1988, I did a book with a colleague, Julia Hales, called The Green Consumer Guide. It sold 1 million copies in 18 months. It went into 20 foreign editions, and it absolutely shocked the wits out of companies. I thought we were going to, I had a consulting business at the time. I thought we were going to lose all of our clients. And instead what happened was that companies like Unilever and Procter & Gamble literally turned up on our doorstep fighting to have us work with them, because we'd actually gone to what really mattered to them, which was consumers and brands and all that sort of stuff. So hard to mobilize, but really important to engage consumers. And I think we've got to find new ways of doing that. What was the second question?
My second question was sort of related to that one, and it's, how do we deal with the lack of trust from stakeholders and other consumers, like you just mentioned? Because I feel we are right now in a world in which people do not trust government because of all these situations that you were mentioning. They were doing everything politic. They were just pushing agendas on people. And on the other hand, they don't trust organizations because of situations like greenwashing. And even if there are more companies who are actually working towards it, you know, always bad things scream louder. And this makes me think that all these situations just take people deeper into the bottom of the U that you were mentioning, in which people are just feeling more fear and anxiety and sadness, and we lose faith. So how do we deal with that lack of trust?
Well, it's a great question, and I wish there was a simple answer to it. And one of the problems I think we collectively face is that the new technologies, social media and so on, are very actively undermining our trust in major institutions. They're like solvents. Facebook and so on would deny it, but I think when you stand far enough back from what's happening, that is a crucial element of this declining trust. But that has been going on for quite some time. It's also precisely what you'd expect in one of these U-bend moments where an older order comes apart, and people are all pointing to the people who used to run politics, used to run business and so on, and saying, you've lost control, we don't trust you. And they don't yet know enough about the people who are going to build the next economy. It won't be the same people mainly. And so part of the answer is, one of the reasons why I say get out more and go and see people who are working on the future, is and build trust networks around them, is they're going to need it as they come through with some of the stuff that they're doing. So I think trust will not recover anytime soon. And I think one of the things we've got to do is just call out the activities of people who are very actively are trying to undermine political institutions, faith in the courts. I mean, look at what's happening in Israel at the moment with Netanyahu fighting his entire nation, trying to change the sort of the judicial structure there. Those battles will become increasingly common, I'm afraid, and that's again why I say all of this is going to become, whether we like it or not. I don't. I'm not. I don't consider myself to be wildly political, but this is going to be politicized, and that does mean that we're going to have to do the politics as well. If anyone else has got better ideas on how we restore trust in our societies, do put your hand up. But Nathan.
Hello, sir. Again, thank you very much for being here. So I'm currently studying, I'm doing engineering technology with focus in renewable energy, and I'm doing a business management degree because I'm wanting to do something similar to you. And
well done.
I'm part of a group here called the Society of Manufacturing Engineers, and we devised a plastic recycling scheme that should hopefully replace large-scale recycling. So we've come up with a way where you incorporate your engineering departments on campus as part of, I don't know if you know what senior design is. It's as an engineer in your last year, you have to do a project, and it's part of what you use to market your skills as an engineer. So my question for you is, we're talking about bureaucratics and politics and along those lines. How would you go about, it's a little bit of a nuanced skill. I know you've been doing it for a long time. How do I go about speaking to people in power, now specifically in my situation at a university, and telling them, listen, currently you outsource plastic recycling, people come collect it and you pay them to come do it, but we found a potential way where we can do it for cheaper, A, and B, we can enrich, students like me who want to contribute to recycling, we've got a say in it, because a lot of times people will pay for this recycling and people don't know it gets dropped off at a landfill.
Well, I think, I mean, I love that question, partly, and the reason I was laughing, I've just come off, our small organization, Volans, does a regular book club. And today the author we had was Jane Davidson. And she used to be a minister for 7 years in the Welsh government in Wales. And then was minister for housing, education, something else, and sustainability. And she said at some point, somebody in the audience asked her a question about, did you suddenly wake up to the need for change and start to do it? And her answer was actually, I thought, quite interesting. Even when she grew up in Zimbabwe, or Rhodesia at the time, but she said at school they would serve milk that, because it was left out in the heat, was really unpleasant to drink. So she launched a campaign among her fellow students to stop that, or have the milk stored somewhere sensible. And so she's always been a troublemaker. Well, I use that in a positive term, always trying to move things along. But she then said, and this goes to your question, and it is true of any university, she said, when you come up and you ask an institution or an organization to change, they're not going to really want to hear that at all, because you're asking them to do something they're not currently doing. There are all sorts of reasons why that would be a problem. So I think you've got to be patient. You've got to think about, how does this institution see the world, and how can we, and the problem is, as a student, you're only in an educational institution for a relatively short period of time. So can you build the institutional forms, the networks and so on, that have a life beyond your student life, that will continue to agitate, continue to bring pressure to bear? But I think the most powerful way of moving change forward is to do exactly what you say, is to find best practice elsewhere, examples of where other people are making a success of doing something, and to share those more broadly. But I don't work in an educational institution. I'm visiting professor of 3, but it means I parachute in and then I parachute out the same day. I don't have to sort out all of the institutional headaches that everyone else has to deal with. If you work out how to do that, let me know. I'd be fascinated. But it's great that you're thinking of moving into renewables. I think that sector has huge potential.
Thank you very much, sir.
Okay, thank you all. Because of time constraints, the next will be the final question. So
I don't
please.
mind. I don't mind
okay.
taking 2 or 3. I mean 3, and then I can respond to them all. I mean.
Okay, excellent. So we have just 3 final questions. Okay, let's go with Leonard Sebastian.
Hi, and thank you for taking my question. So
yeah,
recently, for example, Apple, Google, Dell, Microsoft, and Tesla, they've been named as defendants regarding a case presented by the International Rights Advocate.
yeah.
And it accuses these companies of silently aiding the death and misery of Congolese cobalt miners.
Yeah.
So, and well, obviously we've seen this time and time again, and this is our modern form of, I think, colonialism, imperialism. So how could you effectively regulate these trillion-dollar companies from just basically outsourcing their way to net zero and taking advantage of war-torn countries and with non-existent justice systems? Because it just seems,
Thanks, Vanessa.
Hi, well, thank you for being here and your time. And regarding what you say of recalling the triple bottom line, my question is on that field.
Yeah.
On the economic prosperity. What do you think, or how will this policy will benefit the local economy in the country that is up? And what will be the impact of this proposal to create more jobs? Thank you.
Thank you. That was breaking up a little at my end, but I think I've got the gist of it. Jason.
So yes, my question is, in your opinion, what is the best path to take after all this crisis when it comes to the economy and globalization?
The best path, that's a huge question, isn't it? Well, let me just try and tackle those 3. Well, firstly, with the tech companies that you referenced and their supply chains, one of the critical things is to just get more transparency into those supply chains. So, for example, 2 weeks ago, I was in Paris with a group called EcoVadis, and I've been with them since they were founded in 2007. There were 3 people then. There are now 1,700 around the world. And what they do is they track over 100,000 companies and their supply chains on the whole range of sustainability related issues. And I think that sort of work, it's fairly basic and foundational, but we've got to do a lot more of that. There's another area which I think is absolutely crucial, which is investigative journalism. There are NGOs like Global Witness who spotlight the work of what they call environmental defenders. Something like 200 environmental activists and journalists and so on are killed every year. We need to support the people who are doing that investigative journalism in any ways that we can, because I don't think that governments currently have the resources or very often the political will to expand beyond their national boundaries into other people's jurisdictions, particularly when it comes to pretty nasty conflict zones like Congo. And I think it comes back to investors and it comes back to consumers. It comes back to market actors over time to put sustained pressure on some of these businesses to stop doing what they're doing and start doing different things. So it's a fairly generalized answer to the question, but that's the best I can do in the time. the triple bottom line recall was only in part an assessment that it was failing. It wasn't failing. There are now something over 6,000 B corporations around the world, as many of you will know, which are all chartered around the triple bottom line. Many of those are big companies. I mean, Unilever owns 8 B corporations last time I looked. Natura in Brazil, one of the biggest companies in Brazil, is a B corporation, and so on and so on. So the triple bottom line continues to evolve. What I was trying to say to people was, as you do it, do not think of this simply as a trade-off, because that's what so many people were doing. They were saying, well, we're making a profit, that ticks the economic box. Well, really, no, it doesn't. It's your very particular slice of that economic picture. We're cleaning up to some degree. That ticks the environmental box. Well, you may be cleaning up the local water or air, but what are you doing on the greenhouse effect or whatever it might be? And then the social piece, coming back to jobs, that is one of the most tricky areas for particularly US-based multinational corporations to address. Walmart, for example, after Hurricane Katrina, went very hard through its supply chain on cleaning up sort of climate-related emissions, but it really wouldn't touch the social side, the community side, the fair wage side of things. And so my message was, if you're going to do this at all, and if you're going to claim to be doing it, go at it in an integrated way. And there are a growing number of examples of how that's best done. We can discuss that later on. I've slightly forgotten what that third question was. Can you just very quickly remind me? It was how do we save the economy? How do we change it? It was one of those very big questions. I think it has to be from the bottom up. I mean, I like the Inflation Reduction Act. It has things like that will have a very big enabling impact, but we've got to grow the business of the future using the technologies and the business models of the future from relatively small sized organizations. I find that immensely exciting, and partly the challenge of my job, my role, is to just keep track of all of the different things that are now happening on so many different fronts. And many of you will go into occupations that my generation didn't even know would potentially exist in the future, or businesses that were doing the sorts of things that we couldn't have imagined. So I think the one thing I would conclude by saying, and it's sort of an answer to the question that I've been asked more than any other. People tend to say, are you a pessimist now knowing what you know, or are you an optimist? And I say, it really does. And I started by saying this, it oscillates, not quite day to day, but sometimes. But I do think we're at one of these points where there is an inflection point taking place, and where things can go exponential if we decide that's the way that we want things to go and put our collective muscle behind that. And I think your generation, it has an extraordinary challenge ahead of it, but also an extraordinarily exciting set of opportunities. But do not let my generation tell you, we tried, we were environmentalists. No, they weren't, most of them. And don't let them just go off quietly into retirement. Drag them back into this space, because a lot of them now have the wealth, they have the influence, they continue to vote. This sort of pan-generational working, I think, is going to be immensely important. So good luck to you all. Anyone's minded, do use my email address. Thanks again, everyone, for the invitation. So Alfonso, back to you.